Hello everyone, I'm Inverse, and welcome to my very first Company of Heroes 2 cast. This is a very exciting moment for me. This is the very first time I'll be able to show you guys some Company of Heroes 2 action over here on my channel. In partnership with Relic and Sega, myself as well as a number of other Company of Heroes casters have been granted permission to release Company of Heroes 2 beta shoutcasts over the next 2 weeks, culminating of course in the big Sunday Night Fights presentation on April 28th over on kotu.org. This is going to be, as my first video, a general overview of the Soviet faction. I'll be recording another video right afterwards that's going to go up at the exact same time and will outline the general kind of the general outline of the Austere faction as well. I'm going to try to pronounce it properly as well, otherwise Amy will have my neck. But we'll see about that when we get there. But without further ado, let's jump into this game right now and get started here. This is a game between myself as the Soviets down here on the bottom left, and Iperta, I believe is how you pronounce that name, as the Austere on the right hand side. This map is Pripyat. It's a 2 to 4 player map with no winter, no cold tech on this map, and fairly straightforward resource distribution. A fuel point up here, a fuel point down here, some munitions points here in the middle here and here, and then a smattering of strategic points throughout the map. Now, as for openings with Soviets, it's very useful to think of the Soviets as an American faction analog, and to think of the Austere as being very similar to the Wehrmacht in vanilla Company of Heroes. This is very true for a number of reasons. First of all, the Soviets in their conscripts have a fairly close representation of the rifle squad. It of course comes out of the Tier 0 building, I guess you'd call it, excuse me. It comes out of the Tier 0 building, the HQ building. Soviets also have a Tier 1 building that gives penal battalions and later on elite infantry. Rather than having them called in on the field, they come in from the Tier 1 building. But for the purposes of this video, and for the purposes of a lot of my videos, I'll be showcasing a Tier 2, Tier 3 strategy, which is something I've had a lot of success with so far in the beta, but that's something I'll be talking about in a bit more detail for those of you who've been playing the beta and have been looking for effective Soviet strategies. That's something I'll be going over a little bit later. But much like the American faction in vanilla Company of Heroes, the Soviet faction is a very aggressive early game faction. It's a faction that requires you to put some pressure on in the early game. It's almost identical in the dynamic to the American Wehrmacht kind of flow of the game, where as the Americans, of course, you're trying to deal some damage early on so that you can get yourself a decent advantage, so that going into the mid and late game, where the Wehrmacht player has superiority in terms of the units he can build, you have superiority because you've given yourself a bit of an advantage in that early game. That's very similar to how you need to be thinking about things as a Soviet player. Is late game Austere armor can be very difficult to deal with, and your best defense against that is putting yourself in an advantageous position going into that late game. As we can see, I have 4 conscripts right now. This is a start that I've been using a lot, of course, very similar again to the 4 rifle opening. And after this, I've been getting healing very quickly, which is another nice little upgrade that you can get over at the Soviet headquarters. Now, the Grenadier conscript dynamic is very interesting right now, because there's not exactly the same dynamic as there was in vanilla Company of Heroes, where, you know, you're probably going to want to get in close with rifle squads, you're going to want to stay at range with folk squads. There's not really that much of that going on anymore. Both Grenadiers and Soviet conscripts do a comparable amount of damage from all ranges. Of course, the Soviet conscript has more men. The Gren squad has less men, but of course has more health per man. which is something you have to keep in mind, but is not something that's necessarily a huge deal. Of course, flanking for the Soviets is definitely something you want to be doing, as we see right here. Nice little flank coming in on this middle side. MGs are fairly effective at suppressing right now, and a lot of the maps are very cramped, making flanking a little bit difficult in some situations. But at the same time, proper positioning and proper control going into a flank is absolutely valuable, much as it is in vanilla Company of Heroes. An interesting thing to note about Company of Heroes 2 is losing an MG or losing any weapon team on retreat actually drops the weapon. So makes you a little bit more cautious as a austere player, knowing that even if my opponent kills, even if I pick my weapon team up and get him to retreat, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to keep it out of my opponent's hands if he manages to kill it on retreat. Now, another thing I want to talk about is territory points, resource points, because the way Company of Heroes 2 does resource points is a little bit different from the way vanilla Company of Heroes does it. As you can see, there are fuel points, there's munitions points, and these munitions points both give 11 munitions per minute. Fuel points give 7 extra fuel per minute. Now, a big difference is the fact that strategic points give both fuel and munitions. They no longer give simply manpower. In fact, they don't give any manpower at all. They give a little bit of fuel and a little bit of munitions, and you can build munition or fuel specific observation posts on those points in order to enhance your income. At this point, I haven't found it very valuable to produce those upgrades yet. They can be useful if you're going for some sort of very specific rush, but if you're not going for some really strong early game rush, it's a lot better to focus on getting your unit count up, getting your tech up and stuff like that. Another thing I want to talk about is the upgrade structure for Soviet conscripts. It's very similar to the upgrade structure for rifle squads in vanilla Company of Heroes, in that you have a grenade-like upgrade in the Molotovs, and you also have a sticky bomb-like upgrade in the anti-tank grenades, which are very powerful. They do a lot of damage to both armored cars and half-tracks, which are very quick tier 2 vehicles that you need to be worried about. They also guarantee a engine damaged, or in very rare instances, engine destroyed criticals, which are very valuable, of course, and can make it a lot easier to deal with early game vehicles, because vehicles in the early game are a far more common occurrence in Company of Heroes 2 than they were in vanilla Company of Heroes. Of course, you'd see early jeeps, early bikes, stuff like that, but you wouldn't really see a powerful vehicle, something like an M8 or a Puma, until the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minute mark. And in Company of Heroes 2, vehicles that are more powerful are also a lot more common. You see this half-track, which came out around the 6-minute mark. You can get armored cars, which are actually not that powerful. They're actually far better as a light vehicle counter than they are as an infantry counter. But you can get those very quickly, sometimes around the 3.5, 4 minute mark. It's just something you have to keep in mind as being a little bit different from the way vanilla Company of Heroes does things. The fact that you have to account a little bit in the early game for some sort of vehicle play. And the Soviet anti-tank grenade is an absolutely essential counter to that kind of play. It's extremely powerful, relatively cheap, and with the abundance of munitions in Company of Heroes 2. Munitions is very easy to get in Company of Heroes 2 because, of course, every resource point is going to give you munitions. It makes munitions-based anti-tank upgrades extremely powerful because they're very spammable. And it's very easy to, if not necessarily kill a half-track outright, at least delay it until you can get some sort of counter yourself. As you can see right now, me getting an anti-tank gun. I'll be talking a bit more specifically about the strategy I use in both my first-person videos and also my strategy-specific videos that I'll be following in the next few weeks. Just so you guys know, if you're not wondering why I'm not talking specifically about stuff like that, it will come, do not worry. The Tier 2 for Soviets is, in my opinion, an essential building. It gives you AT guns, it gives you mortars, which are extremely powerful as well. It gives you MGs. However, I've found little use for the Soviet MG at this point. It's kind of like the American 30 caliber machine gun in a certain sense. It deals a lot more damage, and it actually sets up a lot quicker than the austere machine gun. It also has 6 men, which makes it extremely durable. However, it has a very poor cone of fire, and it doesn't deal as much suppression. Again, very similar, of course, to the 30 caliber machine gun from the Americans in Vanilla Company of Heroes. We will be seeing me teching up very shortly to Tier 3. Tier 3 is... It's interesting how they've delineated the different tiers in Company of Heroes 2. It's slightly different from the way they've done things in Company of Heroes 1. Tier 2 for both sides gives you AT guns. This is different, of course, from the American Vanilla Company of Heroes model, where Tier 2 gave, for American support units, primarily infantry support units at that, and required you to wait until Tier 3 to get vehicle support units. This has been standardized a little bit in Company of Heroes 2, and you get both vehicle support units and some minor infantry support units in Tier 2. In Tier 1, you get more powerful infantry for the Soviets. In this case, you get, as I mentioned before, penal battalions, later on elite infantry, if the doctrine you selected is a doctrine that allows you to get elite infantry. And you also get snipers and a light vehicle. So, in general, a scout car for the Soviets. This is different, of course, slightly to the way Austere gets their upgrades, but that's something we'll talk about in the next video. The Tier 3 is going up right now. I have my healing upgrade, as I mentioned earlier. I've also gotten my AT gun upgrade, but I generally delay my Molotov upgrade. And that's just because it's relatively easy. It's kind of like the Panzer Elite's incendiary grenades, where it can be relatively easy to dodge if your opponent's awake and knows what he's doing. But can be very valuable on the winter map, Kolodny, I believe is how you pronounce it. And so will be something that I will be showing you guys a little bit later, because it is definitely a viable, powerful strategy. But as you can see, there's not much remarkable in terms of the way Soviets play relative to the way Americans played in Vanilla Company of Heroes. A lot of the same general philosophies apply, supporting your infantry with other infantry, getting upgrades for your infantry. You see with my conscripts, based on the doctrine I selected, which was the Guard Rifles Anti-Tank Doctrine, I was given access to some machine guns, which are an extremely powerful way, an extremely useful way to give your conscripts parity with mid-game austere infantry, because Gren squads with light machine guns, Panzer Grenadiers, which come out of Tier 2 now, and have, I believe it's MP44s, are very powerful short range. However, a combination of submachine guns and the hit the dirt ability, which is this ability right here that you get from the Guard Rifles Anti-Tank Doctrine, makes it very difficult for an Axis player to dislodge well-positioned conscript infantry. But it can definitely be done, and that's of course something I'll be talking about in my next segment. And there's a T7 or a T34. This is something I always call this thing a T17. I don't know why I always call this a T17. Literally every single time I've talked to friends, or I've been playing a 2v2, and I'm like, yeah man, I've got a T17, and my teammate's like, what? you have a what? And I'm like, yeah man, I have a T17. What are you talking about? Don't you know what a T17 is? And it's not a T17. It's half a T17 though, or it's twice a T17 rather. It's a T34. So that's how I get out of it. Very clever like that. But anyways, the T34 is, in a funny sense, in the current position, in the current where the metagame is right now, the T-34 is actually a lot like the M8, and it's an interesting. It's interesting to think about because it's of course comes a lot. Excuse me for my coughing. I apologize. This has been driving me crazy over the past few days. If you've been watching my stream, but anyways, it comes a little bit later, obviously, than the traditional M8. We see this one came out around the 12-minute mark, which is relatively quick for a T-34 anyways. However, it's really the best all-around tank and the best all-around vehicle unit that the Soviets have at their disposal. The T-70 is a lighter, primarily anti-tank and anti-light vehicle tank, or anti-infantry rather, and anti-light vehicle tank that gives a decent amount of strength to straight infantry engagements, but lacks power against even anti-tank guns. It's extremely vulnerable. In fact, at the beginning of the beta, it would actually take a ridiculous amount of damage from packs and would sometimes get be one-shot and even single-shot decreed by packs, which was never something that would be fun to see. So for that reason, I've switched to using mainly T-34s. There's definitely a place for the T-70. However, the T-34 is far more versatile. It can handle nearly anything in the austere tier 3, definitely anything in the austere tier 2, and support anything in the austere tier 4. This is another way in which Company of Heroes 2 differentiates slightly from Company of Heroes 1. The austere tier 4 is primarily an anti-tank tier. They have a very powerful anti-tank gun. They have a very powerful, a very powerful assault gun, and it's a tier that I haven't used personally, preferring mostly tier 3, because both of the higher tiers are extremely expensive, and that is something that is usually difficult to afford if you've been upgrading your conscripts and stuff like that. And that's pretty much the end of this replay and the end of my introduction to the Soviet faction. Later on, in fact, right over the other video on my channel right now is an introduction to the austere faction, if that is something you would be interested in checking out. Later on in the week, I will be posting StratTalk videos outlining some of my strategies, playing both Soviets and austere, as well as a number of other prominent players' strategies. And I will also be posting a number of first-person videos, because I'm not allowed to stream this. So I will be posting some first-person videos with commentary, and I'll be posting those on my YouTube channel as well. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you stick around and check out the Company of Heroes 2 footage that is definitely to come. I'll see you guys next time.